Hello. In this video we will firstly see how ClassWiz can be used to represent different kinds of numbers, and we'll then consider some ways in which these can be used to help students to learn. We'll consider in particular decimals, fractions and percentages and explore the relationships between these. So turn on your ClassWiz and we'll set it up. We'll be using Calculate mode in this video, so we choose this mode by tapping Menu and number 1. We use Math mode to allow the ClassWiz to use natural mathematical display. So tap Shift and Setup, 1 for input and output, 1 for Math mode. You can see at the top of the screen the small symbols show us that the square root sign shows us that Math mode is in use. When you enter a decimal and use the equals key, so we'll enter a decimal like 0.9 and tap the equals key, we get a fraction. The S to D key, the one here, will allow you to show a decimal instead, or tap it again to get a fraction instead. Notice that 0.90 gives the same fraction, although some students think that 90 is larger than 9, so that 0.90 should be larger than 0.9. If the leading 0 is omitted, which is a poor practice, the ClassWiz tolerates this, but still refers it to gives a fraction and 0.9 in the correct way. Similarly, for a negative number, use the special negative key, which is the one over here, -9, rather than the subtraction key. Notice the subtraction key and the negative key are different. Sometimes a decimal result is preferred and a fraction result is unhelpful. For example, to find the area of a classroom that is 5.9 metres wide and 10.3 metres long, we don't want the result as a fraction, so tap the Shift key up here and then the equals key to get the result as a decimal. Notice there is a symbol here above the equals key to show approximately equals. Now let's look at entering fractions into ClassWiz. There are several ways to do so. To enter the fraction 3/8, you can start with the fraction key, enter the 3, use the down arrow key and enter the 8. And notice the cursor is flashing to show where the number is. When we tap equals, we can see the fraction 3/8, and we can of course display it as a decimal using the S to D key, or go back again using the S to D key. Another way to show a fraction is to start with the numerator. Start with 3, enter the fraction key, and then enter the 8. And we can see 3/8 is represented there. Some fractions have a numerator larger than the denominator. We call these improper fractions. So in this case, 11 fraction 8 gives the result 11/8. If you would prefer to see the result only using proper fractions, use the command above the S to D key. First tap the Shift key and notice S to D key now turns the number into 1 3/8. You can of course change it back again by doing the same thing. If you would prefer to always represent fractions as proper fractions, you can change this in the Setup menu. Shift and Setup, go down to where it says Fraction Result, which is number 1, and there's a choice between proper and improper fractions. In this case, if I change by pressing number 1, then the result will always be a proper fraction. And we can always change it from one to the other like this. However, I prefer to see improper fractions, so I'm going to change my ClassWiz back to, using the fraction result, back to the second one. If you want to enter a number that has an integer part and a fraction part, you can do this in two ways. One way is to tap Shift and the fraction key, and you can see that here we can put the 2 for 2 3/4, move across the 3 for the numerator and the 4 for the denominator, and we get the result 11/4. We could, of course, change that as before, back into 2 3/4, or leave it as 11/4. The other way is to start with the number 2 to make 2 3/4, and then tap Shift and the fraction key, and you can see the familiar fraction symbols, 3, and move down to 4 and tap equals to get 2 3/4. ClassWiz will let you do any computations with fractions directly. So, for example, to add 1/2 and 3/4, we start with adding 1/2, and notice the fraction is got a flashing cursor in the denominator. We need to move across to put the plus sign in, and then 3/4, 3 and fraction 4, and the result is 5/4. Notice that if you don't move the cursor out of the first fraction, then the result will be not what you expect. So if we were to again try to add 1/2 and 3/4 and simply add 3/4, add 3/4, you can see there's a very different kind of result. So you need to be careful to put the cursor in the right place. Finally, what about representing percentages? ClassWiz will let you enter a percentage using the percentage symbol, which is down here above the answer key on the bottom row. The percentage sign is used in the same way as it is in normal mathematical writing. So here, for example, is 37%. 37, we tap the Shift key because the percentage is above the answer key, 37%. And of course, ClassWiz represents it as a fraction, as it always does in math mode. If we want it as a decimal, we can tap the S to D key to show the decimal equivalent of 0.37. Of course, percentages can be greater than 100%, such as 121%, which the ClassWiz handles exactly in the same way. 121% and 121 over 100, or again, if you prefer, 1 21 hundredths, or if you prefer, again, the decimal number. Now that we've seen how to enter numbers into ClassWiz and seen how ClassWiz represents them, let's consider what can be learned by students using the calculator. Firstly, thinking about decimals and place value. Students can see on their ClassWiz that adding zeros at the end of a decimal has no effect on the size of the decimal. So 0.3 gives us 3/10. 0.300 also gives us 3/10. And 0.3 with lots of zeros also gives us 3/10. So they can see that the zero after the decimal place has no effect. But adding a zero at the front of a decimal has a big effect. So if we have 0.7, which of course is 7/10, if we were to enter 0.07, and some students think a zero is nothing, so it won't change anything, but of course it changes it. We have the number 7/100ths, and if we put 2 zeros at the front, we have the number 7,000ths, and so on. Students can see the structure of decimal numbers by seeing how the ClassWiz responds to them. Thinking about fractions, students with a ClassWiz can complete any computation with fractions without tedious formal rules, which are frequently misunderstood or slavishly followed. Let's look at an example. To see the difference between 3/4 and 2/3, students can subtract one from the other. 3/4, move to the right to move the cursor out of the fraction, subtract 2/3, and the result is given immediately as 1/12. Students can see by adding back the 1/12 how this works. That in fact, if we have 2/3 and add 1/12, we get the result we started with, which is 3/4, just the same as we do with other numbers. Similarly, thinking about division, to see how many times 6 can be divided by 2/3. Students often find a problem like this very difficult. The result is 9, and they can check that this makes sense by saying, well, what's 9 multiplied by 2/3? And see that the result is 6 again. So they can begin to understand that fractions are just work in the same way as other numbers. Operations like this help students to understand that fractions are just different representations of numbers, and they follow the same rules. A key idea of fractions is that of equivalent fractions, that the same number can be represented as a fraction in many equivalent ways. ClassWiz routinely shows the simplest version, but students can see with a calculator that there are many equivalent fractions for any fraction. So 4/10, for example, comes up as the fraction 2/5. Students will be surprised by this at first, but of course it's still the decimal 0.4, as they can see. 0.4 and 4/10 and 2/5 are all at the same place on the number line. Using ClassWiz will help students to appreciate that a fraction is a representation of just one number and not two numbers, as many students seem to think, and the S to D key helps them to see what the number is by showing it as a decimal. Students can use ClassWiz to understand how and why equivalent fractions work, as they can complete any fraction calculations easily. Multiplying a fraction by 1 doesn't change its value, so reversing this process gives the same value. So let's see how that works. If we have the fraction 8/10 and we multiply it by 1 in the form of 13/13, this is an example of 1, we get the same result as we do for 8/10, which is 4/5. We could think of this fraction as 104, which is 8/13, over 130. 104 over 130. It's a very different fraction from 8/10 and a very different fraction from 4/5, but it gives the same result. Similarly, if we were to have the fraction 52 over 65, we still get the same result. So students can see that many fractions are the same number. This idea is used in one of the investigations in the Investigating Mathematics book with ClassWiz that can be downloaded from the Worldwide Education website. You can see here the beginnings of that investigation, where students can explore for themselves how fractions work and begin to understand some of the connections between fractions and decimals and the relationships between them. Every fraction has an equivalent decimal. So if we put in a fraction, for example, 3/8, we'll get a fraction, but we can always find the decimal by tapping the S to D key. It can be inconvenient to tap the S to D key. Sometimes we might want the decimal directly. So we can use on the ClassWiz, say 55 divided by 200, and tap Shift and the equals key, which will immediately produce the decimal result. Sometimes the decimal terminates, as for these two examples. That is, there's only a small number of decimal places and it stops. But sometimes the decimal requires all of the screen, like this example, 23/17. When we turn that into a decimal, we require many decimal places. And some decimals can be represented as fractions, like 0.65 can be represented as a fraction, and the ClassWiz does that automatically. 0.275, it will automatically produce the result 11/40. Unless the fractions require numbers that are too large to show. So in this case, for example, a large number of decimal places, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, we turn it into a fraction with the S to D key and nothing happens. Only the original decimal is shown. But students can use the class whiz for themselves to confirm that the fractional representation 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 over 100,000 is in fact the decimal 0.23457. And it's a good feeling for students to have intuitions that are confirmed like that. The class whiz can't handle it, but they can handle it themselves, which of course is the object of learning mathematics. There are many opportunities for students to explore and appreciate the relationships between fractions and decimals every time they use their class whiz. An especially interesting relationship involves the idea of recurring or repeating decimals. While some fractions are represented by terminating decimals, and here's an example, 37/80ths is a terminating decimal, as you can see. Others are not. So 1/3, when we turn to a decimal, does not terminate. It seems to go on forever. And some of them do so in interesting ways, like this one, 13/99. When we turn into a decimal, it looks like it's repeating 0.131313. In some cases, the way the class whiz rounds numbers might give an impression that the decimal is not in fact repeating, like this one, 2/3. When we turn it into a decimal, it doesn't seem that all the numbers are the same. The last one is a 7. Students need to think deeply about the idea of a recurring decimal to understand what is happening here. But class whiz provides both the motivation and the means to do this. This video has shown you some of the many ways in which class whiz can be used to help students to understand fractions and decimals. We've looked briefly at decimals, at fractions, at percentages, at equivalent fractions, at improper fractions, and recurring decimals. You'll find Module 2 of the class whiz book, which is this one here, Learning Mathematics with Class Whiz, will have many useful ideas for students to think about. It's been designed for both teachers and students. It can be copied for students to use as well as for teachers to use. And the module on fractions and decimals includes some exercises to check that students can use their class whiz efficiently, some examples of activities to do, and some guidance for teachers. You can download this book freely from the Casio Worldwide Education website, as you can see at the bottom of the screen. We hope that you find this video and the printed resources useful. Happy calculating!